It's more than a year till the Iowa caucuses, and already Democrats lining up against President Trump in 2020. One White House hopeful is one of the most well-known voices in the Senate and has staked out her brand on policy and making the economy work for everyone. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts has launched her presidential exploratory committee for president, and she joins me now. And we want to welcome our Bloomberg Boston radio audience who is listening as well. Senator Warren, thank you very much for joining us.
Delighted to be here.
Policy-wise, you've made the centerpiece of your campaign so far the idea of a wealth tax. A tax on people who have over $50 million in wealth. What is important about that? Is that about raising revenue for the government, or is that simply about sort of ameliorating inequality?
So, look, I want to talk about the wealth tax, but I just want to push back a little bit on what the centerpiece is. The centerpiece is that Washington is broken. And right now, it works great if you're a billionaire. It works great if you are a giant multinational corporation. It works great for the wealthy and the well-connected, and it is not working for the rest of America. And the question is, why not? And it's because those people with a lot of money buy a lot of political influence in Washington. And year by year, year by year, year by year, they've gone to Washington for decades now and said, hey, listen, can we just change the rules just on this part? Can we just a little bit? And then how about just a little bit more and just a little bit more, until now we live in an America where the tippy top, 0.1% of America now has about as much wealth as 90% of America. And the problem with that is that we need those folks just to pay a fair share in taxes so we can make investments, so that Washington works, so that government works to create opportunities for everybody else.
So the primary benefit of the tax is of making the system work better. It's not about raising revenue per se. Well, it's not about what critics would say punishing the rich. It's about making democracy work better.
It's about making democracy work better so that we make this economy work better. Look, I think it's great. You were successful, God bless. But part of the deal is you pay back so the next kid gets a chance to be successful, and the kid after that, and the kid after that, and the kid after that. And that's the part that's not working in America today. And that's why we have to make some big systemic changes. So when you ask me about the centerpiece, I'm going to say it actually starts with an anti-corruption bill that tries to reduce the influence of money in Washington. And from there, we swing into accountable capitalism, right? You know about this piece. And into a wealth tax, into making this economy work for everyone.
That's interesting you talked about accountable capitalism, because I'm sure there are a lot of Bloomberg readers, Bloomberg viewers that think of you as a socialist. Whatever. I'm sure that's what they would think. Elizabeth Warren, socialist. That being said, at one point, I think that was mainly seen as a pejorative in American politics, but there are more people who identify as such positively. What do you think about that term, and what would you say to people within the Democratic Party that say socialism is a good path forward?
Look, I believe in capitalism. I see the wealth that can be produced, but let's be really clear. Capitalism without rules is theft. Encouraging companies to build their business models on cheating people, that's not capitalism. That's not competition in the marketplace. That's not producing consumer surplus. So what I believe is capitalism with serious rules. And that means rules where everybody gets a chance to play.
Speaking of rules, a criticism of a wealth tax is that it would be really hard to enforce. People have ways to hide how much wealth they have. It's difficult to measure. They could move wealth internationally. How much would a successful implementation of a wealth tax essentially require global cooperation so that people can't easily just shuffle their assets?
Okay, so let's start with the fact that the way this is written says your wealth wherever held. So moving it to one of the islands or moving it to Switzerland, that's not going to get you out from underneath the tax. There's no advantage to taking this, your diamonds or your art or your yacht outside the United States. Part two, remember, the international scene on taxes is changing dramatically. Starting in about 2010, started changing the laws so that companies are more cooperative now with each other in terms of identifying the assets held within their areas. Third part is this bill has really serious enforcement. It says, we get it. Rich people come with their own independent armies of lawyers to try to figure out how to game the system. They've been doing that for a long time. But this says, let's be smart about that. We will have a much stepped up audit schedule for these folks, and you enforce the law. And look, think about the alternative. Are we really going to be in America that says, you know, it's hard to get the rich to abide by the law, so we're just not going to try to impose rules that we otherwise think are right? We can enforce this. Remember, the kind of money we're talking about here, estimate is it's about $2.75 trillion over the next 10 years. That's money we could spend on child care. That's money we could spend to reduce the student loan debt burden. That's a good down payment on a Green New Deal.
I want to ask you a question about the Democratic Party as a whole.
Sure.
It feels like there's just much more enthusiasm to talk about taxes, to talk about raising taxes with a confidence that you don't hear in the past, and also talk about some pretty big spending programs. What's going on, and why do you think it is that the Democratic Party feels more comfortable about taxing and spending, which used to be sort of a criticism of the party that party leaders shied away from?
You're saying, why does this party believe that everybody ought to pay a fair share, including the rich? Why does this party believe that we need to be making more investments so that all of our children get opportunities, not just the children of the rich? The answer is that reality is finally catching up with elected officials in Washington, at least on the Democratic side. These are the things America wants. People are living this. You know, this is the part I find so interesting. When I talk to folks in Washington, they're like, whoa, taxes, what does this mean? Let's talk about this. I go out and talk about this with people across this country, and boy, they get it. They get how the rules are rigged right now to help the wealthy and the well-connected, and they are ready for change. They get it. They may not know the numbers, but they get it right now. The folks, the 0.1%, do you know how much they pay in taxes every year, or will pay in taxes this year? About 3.2% of their net wealth. The 99%, how much will they be paying? About 7.2%. In other words, more than double what the richest Americans are paying. Folks across this country get it, and they want to see change.
Let's shift gears for a second to health care, which is going to be a huge topic. Is there room for private health insurance in your vision of the ideal American healthcare system?
So let's start with the battle we're having right now and talk about the things we need to be doing, because I don't want to lose sight of this.
Okay.
It's good to talk about our overall goal, and here's our overall goal. This is what distinguishes Democrats from Republicans. Democrats believe health care is a basic human right, and we fight for basic human rights. Our obligation is to make sure that everybody gets coverage at the lowest possible cost to all of us. So what does that mean? Right now, it means fighting the Republicans who are trying to sabotage the Affordable Care Act. We've got this lawsuit going on down in Texas where the Republicans are trying to do what they couldn't do with the votes, and that is trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, to make it okay to discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions, to cut off access to health care for millions of Americans. So job number one is to defend the Affordable Care Act. Job number two is to make changes where we need to make them right now. Changes to hold insurance companies accountable when they're trying to cheat people, when they're trying to scam people. Changes right now in what's happening with drugs, prescription drugs. We need to lower the cost of prescription drugs. 1 in 4 Americans say they can't take drugs that are prescribed to them because they can't afford to pay for them. I have, for example, here a proposal for generic drugs, which are about 90% of all the prescriptions that people fill, to be able to bring those costs down to just a nominal cost. And the third, how do we get universal coverage? Medicare for all. Lots of paths for how to do that. But we know where we are aiming, and that is that every American has health care at a price that they can afford, and that the overall costs in the system are held as low as possible.
But right now, your vision for Medicare for All, would it all be a public option, or would it include private insurance?
So right now, there are multiple bills on the floor in the United States Senate. I've signed on to Medicare for All. I've signed on to another one that gives an option for buying into Medicaid. There are different ways we can get there, but the key has to be always keep the center of the bullseye in mind, and that is affordable health care for every American.
I want to go back to something you said about revenues raised from your wealth tax. You talked about how that could help for child care and a Green New Deal and so forth. There's a growing belief and a growing movement within the Democratic Party that this concept of being restricted by, we have to pay for it in some way, doesn't necessarily make sense. That we shouldn't be afraid of deficits and the debt, that the debt has gone up a lot. It hasn't had negative ramifications. Do you share this view that we don't have to be as scared of deficit spending, that not everything has to be paid for dollar like we've kind of
So I've opposed PAYGO, which is part of what you're talking about as a restraint, because I watched the Republicans. Look, the Republicans say, we want to pay... we want to have a war but not raise taxes to pay for it. Who cares about the national debt? Or they say we're going to give away as it turns out, $1.9 trillion. Don't have to worry about the national debt. It's only when we're talking about the things that go to hardworking families that suddenly the Republicans seem to get religion about the national debt. Now, look, even under current the monetary theories, debt matters. There comes a point where debt matters. But what I care about is that we need to rethink our system in a way that genuinely is about the investments that pay off over time. Think about a federal government right now that treats, if you spend $10 million on a building, as it's the same as if we took $10 million out in the middle of the street and burned it, rather than saying, wait a minute, right. At the end of the day, you've got an asset worth $10 million. Same kind of thing on educating our children. Treating it just as an expense to educate the next generation, it not only makes no sense from a values perspective, it actually makes no sense from an economic perspective. We know, for example, that the GI Bill really paid off over time, not only for the GIs who got an education under that proposal, but also for the entire economy. So I believe very strongly that we have got to shift how we spend money in Washington. We need to make those expenditures more in line with our values. It should be less about billionaires getting to hang on to that last 2% of their bazillion dollars, and more about high-quality child care for all of our kids, or reducing the student loan debt burden so people have a chance to buy a home or start a business.
Something that really interested me in your launch video on your website is you specifically pointed out the deteriorating household wealth conditions of black families in this country. And I'm curious how you're thinking about, as the campaign goes on, connecting a progressive economic message with issues of racial justice.
So this has been an issue I've really worked on pretty much my whole life, has been what's happening to American families. Why is it that people work harder and harder and harder, and yet for millions, the road just keeps getting rockier and rockier? And for African Americans, it's rockier and steeper yet. And the data just show this over and over and over. So I have been writing about this, talking about this for a long time, how these two intersect. Let me just give you one piece of this and how it works, just to think about it. So home ownership is the number one way that middle-class families build wealth. And for a long time, America subsidized home ownership for white families, but redlined black families out of that, affirmatively discriminated against black families having an opportunity to build up that family wealth. And one of the things we've seen is the cumulative effect of that generation by generation. Today, people all across this country are struggling with housing costs, black and white, But the path for African Americans is tougher, both because of generational discrimination. That means generation by generation, they keep starting at a lower point and face a bigger gap and bigger discrimination. This is the kind of thing, as a nation, we have a responsibility to stop, to acknowledge it, and to say we are prepared to take steps to fight back.
All right, quick last question. Turning to foreign policy real quickly, President Warren, what would you be doing right now in Venezuela?
In Venezuela. So the first thing we start with is Maduro is a dictator. He's terrible. He's caused terrible harm to his own people. But we have to be very careful about rattling a saber on military intervention. You don't rattle those sabers unless you're pretty darn sure you can back it up. And need to think about whether or not that's the kind of path we want to follow in South America. I believe right now that our principal effort should go towards supporting the Venezuelan people and not imposing policies that put even greater injury on them.